Welcome to this Club Development Scotland webinar on funding for your sports club. My name is Alan Russell. I'm joined by Andrew Jenkin from Club Development Scotland and Angus Martin from Name of the Game. He's our subject matter expert that we bring in to help clubs with fundraising topics. Andrew and I will ask questions of Angus as we're going through the session today, try to anticipate the questions that you might have as clubs. If there's something that's important to you that doesn't come up in our conversation with Angus, you can reach out to us by email after the webinar, and we'll put together a frequently asked questions guide if there's a lot of things that come up that we haven't covered in the webinar itself. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Angus to get started on the content of this webinar.
Thank you, guys. So just before I get started, just to introduce myself, I work for myself, a company called The Name of the Game, which essentially is there to help support sports organisations in various forms, charities mostly, but some wider sporting organisations to find funding to do more of what you want to do, whatever that ends up being. You know, that's what I spend my time sort of focusing on, looking at what's out there, and then identifying what might work for different organizations and then helping them pull together hopefully strong applications to sort of access that funding. So the guys have asked me to pull together a bit of a presentation on what I think, and that is what I think in terms of how you can become a more sustainable organization in terms of being less at risk, I suppose, of having to either slow down what you're doing or stop your delivery. And the good news is there's lots of funding out there that is diverse funding, but there is lots of it just now. There's even more of it around on the back of COVID for some reason. Whether that lasts for long term or not, I'm not sure, but there are lots of opportunities. And I'll try and run through, I suppose, what I would do if I was in your shoes in terms of putting yourself in the best position to access that funding. And I appreciate you'll all be at different levels, and some of you will already be doing all this. Others it might be brand new to, so hopefully there's something in it for all of you. If not, then apologies. But yeah, sustainability for me, most of the organizations I work with, this is, I guess, the holy grail. You want to be less reliant on one particular source of funding, whatever that might be, whether that's membership subscriptions, whether it's one grant funder, whether it's support from your governing body. You don't want just one main source of income, because if something happens to that, then there's big problems. Equally, it puts you at risk of not being able to do exactly what you want to do if you're having to be a little bit too connected to that one organization, I guess. So what I'm saying there is try and diversify your income, try and have more than one income source, try and have as many as you can, I suppose, but certainly try not to be reliant on one particular income source if you can, or one area of income, because from my experience, things will dry up from time to time in one area, and that might come back, but there might be a gap of however long, and if there's a gap, that might stop you. It might mean you lose a member of staff, it might mean you lose a facility. You want to be able to safeguard against that. A key part of, I think, how you should go about, and I'm sure most of you do, is you need to, whatever you're doing, you need to be able to prove that it works. Somebody, if you're looking to get money from an organization, they need to know that you're a trusted partner, I suppose, that you can do whatever it is you're saying. That'll be different from whatever you're trying to do in the different bids that you put together, but you need to be able to prove whatever you're saying, you can do it, and you can back it up, and you can prove that there's quality in the delivery that you're doing. This is a strange one, but I always say forget the sport that you're talking about. So bowls in this case, forget bowls, but then don't forget bowls. You need to always use your sport as a vehicle for engaging people, I think. Not many people are going to fund you just to do bowls. That's the reality. Very few. You've got one or two sources of funding for that, I guess. But there are lots of people who might fund you if you're able to position bowls as a way to do something good for the community. That might be bringing people together. That might be some intergenerational work. It could be lots of things around tackling loneliness, social isolation. So yeah, you can really go all sorts of things, but equally, if you move too far away from bowls itself, then you lose that basis of why you're there in the first place, and you're going to lose that sort of core membership or base that you have in the beginning. Raising awareness, I think, is pretty key. People need to know you exist. Without that, we're kind of wasting our time. They need to know you exist, and they need to know there's ways to help you. So you need to make it easy for people to make those decisions. And some of those things can take a long time. You need to sometimes position the organization quite far in advance for someone to make a decision, especially if you're going after bigger chunks of money or bigger support. You need to play a bit of a long game there in terms of, it might be somebody somewhere that's going to make a decision, but you might get that decision from them a year later because of all the little tiny steps you've done along the way to make them think that you're an organization worth investing in. Hopefully there's already, and I'm guessing there probably is, but hopefully you already function as a network, because I think you are stronger together like that, where you can come together and even just learn from each other in terms of what's working. Because from my experience, if something works somewhere, and that would be the same in terms of different sports, it can probably work in most places. And if you're happy to share that, then you are all kind of stronger together with that. And it's really important, I think, with the people you've got in your organization, whether that's trustees, members, delivery staff, whatever it is within you're all going to be at different sizes and stages from there. But I think you need to be a little bit enterprising in terms of your approach to be sustainable, because if you just do what you've always done, unless that's amazing what you've already done, then I think you're making it harder for yourself. So those are the areas I want to try and cover in this presentation. And maybe if we can move on to the next slide, Andrew, please. So yeah, I'll just spend a tiny bit of time looking at what I think it means in terms of diversifying your income, because I think that is quite key. You can't, if you are, you're going to set yourself up to fail, really, I think. So you need to look at what's out there, and there's all sorts, lots of grant funding, but equally there's lots of companies that maybe want to invest CSR monies into sport, particularly if you can position the sport as doing something what they would see as bigger than sport. So sort of sport for good or sport for development there. You need to be able to do that and make it easy for them to see how that can work. But yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can diversify your income that I think can, yeah, you need two things there. You need to be looking at what's out there, and that can be a bit time consuming from there, but it is worth doing. So you need to look at, see what the opportunities are. Everything from local supermarkets, they will all have some form of where they invest into local organizations, charities. Well, why not that be you sometimes? You've probably seen it when you walk past, or you come out and you can put your coin to whatever it is and choose whichever good cause it's going to be. Well, if you can position yourself as being good cause, that can be you. So I think it's just working out what your fundraising strategy, what your income generation strategy is, and the more strings you've got to that. Again, it depends a little bit on what your structure is, but if you were a charity, then that opens up other doors. And again, for some of you that are not a charity, maybe longer term, that might be something to think about in terms of what you want to set yourself up as, because it certainly, it certainly opens up more doors for funding. But the more you can look at what's out there, the more you can position yourself to access those different funding streams, I think the better. So probably the next slide, if we can. Okay. So on the back of that, there is no real, well, there is a point going forward, but you're going to be quite short-term. If you can't prove what you do is good, then you might get funding once, but you're unlikely to get it again. So you need to back yourself to be able to do good work, whatever that might be. And you might be used to just being a fairly traditional bowls club, or you might be further forward and more progressive in terms of using bowls as that catalyst for sort of community development. But whatever stage you're at, you need to prove, whoever's giving you money, whether that's a governing body, whether it's a local business, whether it's a supermarket, they need to know what they're getting for their money, and you need to be able to get that back to them in terms of, an efficient way that they can see, actually, hold on, these people are doing fantastic work. I can see this is worth us investing in and keeping that going. So you need to be able to prove that impact, and that's probably more than just numbers. Some people will be happy and say, well, okay, they've engaged with 50 people. Some people want to see more than that, and I suggest it's worth you as organizations maybe looking at how you can capture information from the start. How my case studies, it might be you. There are lots of, well, not lots, but there are some good online monitoring and evaluation software system that you can use to help you do that. Some of them cost money, some of them you can probably access for nothing through sort of membership organizations there, but they're worth looking at. I think partnerships with colleges and universities that can help you, especially as you're moving into broader areas of work. So if you're using bowls as a way, for example, to help reduce loneliness and social isolation in the community, how are you going to prove that that works? That probably needs a little bit more thought, a little bit more of a, not necessarily expertise from there, but you just need to think, well, what are we going to capture? What are we going to measure? And then make sure that your project's doing that, so that when you're going back to get repeat funding, which ideally you'd want from whoever that might be, or to grow the investment you're getting from them, you've got a strong case study there to say, well, actually, you gave us £5,000 last year, and this is what we did with it. You know, if you give us £10,000 this year, we can do da, 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 da. And all of that's scalable. So, but it's worth making sure, I think anyway, whoever's investing into you, you look after them, because, you know, whatever the commitment is, it's still them giving you money. So even if it's inviting them to an event, keeping in touch with them via a newsletter, just some things you can do that don't cost you money, that I think will just help them look at you favorably. So when they're coming to make a decision about where their investment might be, and that's from individual donors through to big companies or grant making bodies, that they think, actually, I like those people, they're nice people, they look after us, they give us what we want, let's carry on with that, or let's try that. So I think that's something that I think all organizations can do. And some of that comes back to how you use your resource yourself. How many, don't know the structure of all of the clubs that we're talking about here in terms of how much manpower they have, and some will have really limited. I'm sure others might have some staff that are able to do things, but whatever it is, I think you need to be able to, or if you can, you need to try and invest into those staff as well, because then you've got more chance of keeping them. So this is all, I guess, a little bit about quality, which I'm sure everyone's committed to, but you need to be able to, from someone looking from the outside, you know, they need to see that you're taking the time to do that, I think, because then it helps. Kite marks, things like that can help in terms of, you know, they can be a bit time consuming to get, but you know, if you've got that and you stick it on your letterhead or whatever it might be, just a bit more credibility. It's just a bit more likely that, or you're taking away a reason for someone not to get. It's like having the right policies and procedures, which you'll all have around safeguarding and things like that. But the more you can make it clear that you are ahead of the game in those areas, I think it makes it easier for people to invest into you. So.
Angus, I guess it may be quite daunting for some clubs to think about this, the burden of this activity, reporting on impact, measurement and evaluation of how the money is being spent. What would you say is a fairly typical estimate of the amount of work it would be to report on a piece of funding after you've implemented it, to report back to the funder about the impact it's had?
That is a good question. It's a strange one as well, because sometimes, and this is not to put people off, but sometimes the smaller amounts of money that you get, the funders actually ask for more information than some of the bigger funders. So it's a strange one, but yeah, I think it's all scalable really. But sometimes you do get, you know, someone might have given you quite a small grant and they're asking for war and peace with it, whereas there's other funders who are very light touch. So I think it's almost, if you know from the beginning that your resource yourself is limited, I think there are funders and partners you can target that are less onerous, if you like, in terms of from this. I wouldn't let anyone put off by going for things from there, but there are some funds that, you know, you might want to take it. I know that some of the organizations I work with go for European funding. Now that's very complicated and probably not something necessarily you want to jump straight into unless you've got that sort of administrative resource around you. Most of I think the funding and grants we maybe be looking at here, I don't think they'd be too onerous in terms of what you are. Or if they are, I think the other thing is, and this is what funders quite like, ask them for support, ask them what they suggest, ask them what is good practice, because the more communication you have with partners and funders like that in the main, I think the better. They don't want you to hide away and then come to them at the end of the grant and say, we didn't know what to do. I think they're quite happy for you to put your hand up and say, well, we're new to this. You know, what can you do? How can you help us?
I think that's a great point, because the funder wants to be able to demonstrate the impact to its trustees, its stakeholders, the people that give it the funding to start with. They want to be able to, you know, clearly demonstrate
They're not looking for
the money that's been invested in projects. So they'll want to create that conversation early, because it means they're going to get quality information back later.
They're not looking to trip you up in the main. I don't really come across any funders like that who are, you know, they're looking to help you. They've seen something in you in the beginning that they want to invest in. They want you to be able to use their resource to, you know, to move forward with whatever it is you're trying to do. So I think that honesty, I guess, is what I'm trying to put across there, and that dialogue with funders if you are struggling, you know, it's a key one not to be scared of, I think. And equally, again, the network of clubs, hopefully there'll be others who've maybe at different stages that you can sort of nick ideas off and learn from. Sometimes you learn from mistakes as well. So again, as a network, you're stronger together, because people can say, well, hold on, we did that, and you know, if we could do it again, it would be easy, but we messed it up. And I think if people can have that dialogue, it's quite helpful.
I wondered, Angus, if you could explain a little, not necessarily explain, but I'm thinking of a typical bowls club, for example, and a project that might look at something like isolation or tackling isolation. What were some of the sort of monitoring and evaluation? What are some of the sort of basic things that a club could do to try and track that?
Yeah, I think it's well, first thing is numbers. They all want you to know the numbers. If you say, well, we're going to engage with 50 people, blah blah blah, whatever. Sometimes it's people coming from a particular area. If it's loneliness and social isolation, there's some quite good. Age UK have some quite useful tools around. In fact, you can go online and do a search, and that'll bring up a heat map of areas that are more at risk for loneliness and social isolation. And sadly, those tend to be more deprived areas. But then again, that's where maybe you're linking funding and saying, well, you know, we're based there. That's actually where we are. So we're going to connect with these people who maybe don't get out of the house normally. Questionnaires, you know, you can make it as simple as you want. You know, you can say, well, the other, you know, really key thing to get across is more and more funders want things to be co-developed and co-designed with the intended audience. So, you know, if you don't know how you're going to do it, that's fine. You could almost say in your bid, we're going to sit down at the start of the project with the participants so that they're comfortable with it and they buy into it, and design, you know, we know we want to make them less lonely. We know we want to make them more active physically and socially, but we don't want this to be invasive for them. We don't want to put them off from getting involved. So, you know, we might set up a tiny steering group just to set up that monitoring and evaluation bit of it so that people are happy. The lottery, they're huge on that in terms of, you know, and that's probably one of the biggest places you can go to for the money. They want things to have been, rather than, you know, the three of us sitting around saying, that's a good idea, let's do that. They need it to know that it's come from the community itself. And that's it. That's something also to think about, is how you get that information. You know, the people might be from the community themselves. If so, that's great. But if they're not, then how are they getting that insight from the local community? So, you know, they need to have, and that might just be having a chat. It doesn't need to be anything scary. You can just be taking the time to talk to people when you see them and saying, well, actually, what are the issues? Because the loneliness and social isolation example, you know, a lot of the projects I do are focused on that, and they've come from, you know, if it's football, for example, it might be a walking football groups who say, well, actually, there's loads of people who would love to do this, but they just don't feel comfortable getting out of the house. They need some extra support to do that. And that'll be the same for bowls, for any sport with that. I think there's lots you can do from that. But the insight is quite key. The monitoring and evaluation, so you don't have to make it scary. And I think you can make it work for yourself. And it can feed into a bit of a cycle there in terms of you proving your impact of the projects, but also continually getting that insight from the participants as to how you can improve the projects as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I think this bit bowls, I think I've kind of touched on that already, but you know, that's where sadly no one's going to give you too much money just to do bowls for the sake of bowls. You know, that's the same across all sports. There's less and less money for sport's sake, and I don't see that changing. But if you can use bowls as a way to improve people's health, which you can, if you can use bowls as a way to improve people's, you know, it could be the mental health by bringing them together. Again, the social element of what you're doing there is huge. Then it becomes a really interesting thing for people to, might be health organizations who might be investing into it rather than more traditional sports organizations then, because I think, you know, you need to let people see that, or help them understand how someone coming along to bowls on a Tuesday morning and then having a cup of coffee afterwards and then having a chat might help, you know, in terms of both them being active physically, being active socially, building up that peer network so they've got increased friendship groups. I think the other thing with bowls that I'd be interested in is that intergenerational element. How can you use bowls to get younger and older people together? Because there's lots you can do with intergenerational projects, and there's lots of younger people don't necessarily meet with older people, and the same vice versa. So if you can use something like that, which might have you might partner up with schools, it could be all sorts of things with that. I think there's loads you can do with that that would be interesting to a funder, because when I say loneliness and social isolation are big issues for funders, I think most people often think of that as being for older people. Loneliness and social isolation are big issues for younger people as well, and sometimes even bigger issues. So, there's lots you can do with bowls, with whatever the sport is, that if you can engage people and bring them together, you become something that's more attractive to a range of funders rather than sport specific funders. But the caveat is, don't forget that you are a bowls organization, and you need that bit of it needs to be probably done better than it's done before. Again, it's always looking at how you can improve that side of the delivery as well, but certainly not to forget that that's what you are. That's why people get involved in the first place. Thank you. So yeah, raising awareness, again, I think this all links in, but people, they need to know that you exist, to just get involved as members if that's what they want to do, to come along and play. But they need to know that you exist and the structure of what you are, so that they can at least think about investing into your organization or supporting it, getting involved as a volunteer, getting involved as a trustee, depending what they are. So you need to be quite visible, or as visible as you can be, and that can be social media is obviously a big part of that, in terms of how you're doing it. Just the signage you use sometimes, lots of things that doesn't necessarily need to cost money. You can use people as ambassadors for that. Some useful working with local MSPs and things like that, just to create, again, awareness. If you're doing something good, if you're tweeting about it, just copying in the right people to that, trying to, again, create a bit of, we're probably not going to get huge media coverage on the back of things in the beginning from there, but there can be some nice angles you can go out there. Certainly once you're looking at bringing older people and younger people together, some of those angles can make for nice stories. And that goes back to, again, playing this sort of longer game. It might be the long-term aim that you want to get local news down to do a feature on it. That's probably not going to happen overnight. It might take a lot of planting seeds that this is happening and just being ready for it at the right time. But I think there's lots you can do with that to make it easier for people to know you're there. And then once they've done that, you need to let them know there's ways for them to get involved, whether that's as a player, as a sponsor, as a partner, as a trustee, as a volunteer. It needs to be clear. Otherwise, people are busy. They're not going to necessarily look out for the information and spend loads of time trawling for it. So even your website, make that as clear as possible in terms of that, how to get involved, and make it, assuming you've got a website. So if you haven't, that needs to be addressed from the beginning from there. But you need to make sure that you're visible and that people can see you in the way that they look for things now. And a lot of that is online. And that's maybe something for some of the clubs to consider.
I think that's a really good point there, and it's something we see across all sports, is that often you forget to tell people the very basic information about. So when is a game happening? When is an open session happening? Where are you? Just making your address really prominent on it. Just really, really simple things here that we often see in lots of sports. That clubs forget to put front and center, almost assuming that everybody knows them already and knows that information already. And that's the biggest barrier when somebody's coming to engage with you for the first time. They actually can't find out where you are, or it seems to be a bit of a secret, almost seems to be a bit of a closed shop. So yeah, making sure, almost put the beginner lens on everything that you do, saying, if I knew nothing about this club already, and looking at every leaflet you've made, looking at your website, looking at your Facebook page, and saying, so if I was coming here completely cold, would I be able to find out what I need to know?
No, I think that's right. And I think it's also making sure that first impression that you give to people is the right one. So making sure that they think that is a welcoming club, that's an inclusive club, that's somewhere that, I could go and feel safe and feel like I could belong there, I suppose. And that comes down to the type of images you use, and that in terms of how you promote what you're doing. So if the images are all of a certain type of person, not deliberately, but you can almost be excluding some people who think, well, okay, that's not for me. I'm not going along there because I don't look like those people. I don't talk like those people, or whatever it might be. So I think it does need a bit of thought. Again, that type of stuff doesn't necessarily need money. It just needs you to think, well, what are the barriers for people getting involved if they're not currently getting involved, and thinking, well, okay, how can we? And there's some really good resources around that from think Sport Scotland have some. I think certainly Sport England have here on websites and things that you can pinch around the type of images, around using inclusive images, but also the right wording, I guess, in terms of making things appeal or not put people off from getting involved. And I think that helps again when you're looking at getting partnerships with companies or businesses. They want to know that, you know, you're not going to lead to them being embarrassed in any kind of way by doing, not saying you're going to do the wrong things, but just by not being that sort of inclusive club that I'm sure everyone wants to be. So I think one other thing to think about, and this is depending on what doesn't matter what the level of the organization is, but partnership can be a really big part of this, because you might think as a club, oh, we're too small to do that, or we can't do this, or we can't do that, or we've never done whatever this is before. Well, sometimes in partnership you can do that. It can either be a couple of clubs working together, or it can be, example being, say you wanted to do a mental health project, but you know, being a bowls club, maybe you've never done anything around mental health. Well, how about a partnership with a mental health charity? Really small things, small steps to begin with, but you've got the engagement strength with a certain group of people. The mental health charity has the expertise. Maybe together you can go for a pilot project that might work. You know, I think there's lots of examples like that where if you can, if it's funding you're going for and you're not, maybe you're not a charity, but there is an organization that is a charity, well, perhaps you can go together with them and say, well, okay, well, let's bid for this together because we've got, you know, strengths that work together that complement each other that we think that work. And I think the mental health one is probably a good example there, because, you know, no one's expecting you as a bowls club to have expertise around mental health, but, you know, through the bid and partnership, well, maybe you can begin to have a little bit of knowledge around that and the light touch stuff, so that you can signpost people if they're having issues. And again, it's just another arm that opens up different funding streams to you, because I see that a lot in wider sport for development charities. You're not ever going to be the expert in mental health, but there is maybe a role for you in that really light touch, supporting people to talk, supporting people to look for wider help themselves, and then knowing how to spot the signs if people are struggling, so you can signpost them on to those who are the experts. So I think that partnership working is quite key, and that can take a while to develop. There's no point, sadly, funding might come out tomorrow and the deadline might be 2 weeks' time. Now, if you've not got partnerships in place, you know, most funders will see through that, I think, in terms of from there. So, you know, it might be that you're trying to set partnerships up now in areas that you want to work in without a particular fund or thing in mind, just because it's what you want to do, because you think at some point we want to work with people, or so we want to do work with people who are struggling with the mental health. So is there an organization around locally that we can start to talk about how a project might fit? Because then you're ready to go when the funds do come out. Or if you see something, you can work up an idea that you might want to take to be proactive and take to someone and say, look, we've got this idea, we think it might work. What do you think? For me, that playing that sort of longer game, that approach, partnerships are a real key part of that, and complementary partnerships are not being, you know, saying, well, we need to do everything ourselves, because you can't do everything yourselves. Certainly as you're branching out from being wider than more than just a bowls organization, I think you need to look at what you want to do as an organization, and then maybe identifying a small number of partners that you want to start having conversations with. They might be other sports, you know, it might be other sports that are more established, that might be more set up as a charity, for example, but you've got something else you want to bring. Or say it might be a mental health charity, or it might be a charity working with older people, or it might be housing. See, housing associations are often quite good because sometimes they have their own money as well in terms of accessing that, and they have clients, if you want to call it that they're looking to support, or you might be able to get some money from them to put on some extra activity that meets that bill. I think this is and I think because a lot of the people who we're talking to, I'm sure, are volunteers in terms of what they're doing already, but you need to look after the people who are working in your clubs, making sure that they get access to training, making sure that they get access to support, and if they don't, then again, talking to other clubs. If one club's cracked it, how did they do that? You know, from what I've found, most organizations are happy to share that learning. They're happy to say, well, this is how we did it, and, you know, come and spend half a day with us, or whatever it might be, or pick up the phone and say, you know, this is how we managed to get funding for this particular thing. You know, this is how we managed to get access to this facility, or this is how we work with schools, or this is whatever it might be. But I think you need to look after those people who are working within your organization, whether they're paid staff, whether they're volunteers, whether they're members, whether they're trustees. You know, whoever's in charge of the organization, I think you've got a bit of a remit there to make sure they're getting access to training and support themselves. And sometimes that's just having a network, giving them access to a network that they can bounce ideas off, or they can go and see such and such from there. But I think it's quite key to make the organization a one that where you're all trying to work together, that you're aimed are the same, I suppose. So that's also involving people in those decision-making processes and making sure that everyone's voice is heard, but make it a fun place to be. Because then if the staff and volunteers are happy, you're more likely to have people who members, and you're more likely to grow the game that way than if they come and everyone's a bit miserable. And it's you see it often in sport, there's lots of politics involved, and the more you can get rid of some of that and just let people focus on what they want to do and the enjoyable parts of sport and bringing people together, the better, from what I can see. And that doesn't matter. The size of your organization doesn't matter, I don't think. That it can be one person as a volunteer, you can have 100 staff. The principles are the same. Obviously, in some ways it's easier if you've got more staff. Some ways it's harder probably as well. But if you're purely volunteer run, it's working out, well, who's going to do what? And it's making sure if you've got that board, whether it's trustees, members, whatever you call them, that they're used. If you brought them on board for a reason, use them. Okay, empower them to do whatever you've brought them. So if you brought someone on board because they're from the bank and you think they're going to know about finance, make sure they're using them for that. But equally, most banks have a CSR type function as well, or a grant giving function. Well, can we have a word with them about that? If it's Lloyds, if it's whoever it might be, Bank of Scotland, they all have things like that. Or if you brought someone on board who's really good with HR, other things are really, you'd say they're boring. But if you don't have the right policies and procedures in place, that can make all this fall down as well. So it's making sure you've got, I guess, that you're setting yourself up as an organization to succeed. And some of that is about bringing the right people to you. And again, people want to, I think, get involved. I often see when it's charities anyway, when it's quite competitive to be a trustee of a charity sometimes, because people see that as a good thing on their CV, whatever it might be. And that's great. But you want to then make sure you're using those people's skill sets to help you as an organization grow, rather than too often you see is one person trying to do everything within the organization because they think, well, if I don't do it, it won't happen. And sometimes that might be true, but I think more often than not, if you're happy to sort of share the workload, you've got more chance of success with that. So that's what I think anyway. I'll wrap. There's more than this, but this is just a list of sort of sources of income. There are lots of ways you can get funding if that's what you need to grow what you're trying to do. So there's lots of grant funding. There really is lots of grant funding. That's everything from £50 up to £500,000. It's scalable really in terms of what is there. And some of it's local funding, some of it's regional, some of it's national. And again, you probably need to just be realistic in terms of where you're positioning yourself in the beginning. So if you've never gone for grants before, it's not realistic to go for something at £500,000. It's just not going to happen. And equally, sometimes you will be either included or unincluded from going for particular grants because of your structure. So you need to look and say, someone will say you must be a charity, some will say you must be this, some will say you must be that to go. Some of them are open for anything. So again, it's a little bit of research around what sort of levels of funding are available for you in your current format. And if you look at that and actually it's really limited, well, maybe that's a wider conversation that you'd have about actually, and maybe we need to look at changing our structure so that we're less reliant on whatever your current income source is, and we can access more of the grant funding that's out there. There are contracts and tenders and things that come from either the government or local authority, and it may be, I'm thinking here, there's a number of sports organizations that I work with who do falls prevention. So they work with typically older people, but they put on almost exercise classes that are helping people reduce the chances of them falling or getting injured. So there's it's a fairly standard program. I think it works. I think it runs in every local authority in the UK, but there's no reason why either it might be using your facilities or longer term that actually you might have staff that can deliver some of that provision as well. And equally, the strength of that is people might be more likely to connect with you because they know who you are, rather than someone coming in who's very sort of statutory body type provision that doesn't always appeal to everyone. I think companies is a good source to look at. And again, that can be everything from the local butchers through to, you know, the co-op and people like that have fairly well functioned CSR type offers. But you know, you see it with kids football teams. The local companies do sponsor lots of things. Why not both? You know, again, you need to give them that reason to do it, and then give them whatever they're looking to get back from it. That might be awareness. You know, it might just be they want a picture in the paper. You know, you just need to understand what people's motivations are for getting involved. Education programs, there's lots you can do around that. You know, in terms of what you can offer, again, perhaps using your facilities, if you've got facilities as a place to do that. Sponsorship, again, local businesses right on through to sort of national companies, depending on what your project is. But there's lots of examples in sports of doing that. There might be some things that the clubs have themselves, that there will be their memberships that that is a source of income for them. So again, that's a bit about going back and not forgetting bowls. So whatever your income sources are just now from standard of playing bowls, there must be ways to maximize those as well, as well as looking at all these other exciting things, ways of raising income. I think there's ways to look at, can you do better at what you're already doing? Can you make it easier for people to pay their subs or their subscriptions? Can you grow the membership base that way, so that, you know, that's another way of increasing your income? Again, depending on the structure of people and what facilities they've got open to them. But events, you know, you can run fundraising events from there that can make a difference. Because I think the downside of project grant funding is you have to use that money for a particular purpose. Whereas if you're raising fundraising, typically that can go towards core costs of the organization in most cases. So that can be used to help build your stability and grow your organization, rather than absolutely just delivering a particular project. So there's lots, but it's even things like Amazon Smile. There's lots of things where you can, you know, again, if you're a charity, you can Amazon and all these sort of online things where you can make your charity something that people can nominate, and then every time they're buying from, every time you're buying from Amazon, it's a tiny amount, but it all adds up. It might be a walk that you organize, it might be, you know, it could be all sorts of things that can help create more income from you as an organization, but they also help with probably creating awareness as well, I think. So if you've got, again, you'd probably want to sit down as a committee or a group and work out what type of fundraising events you might want to do. But there's lots of organizations going to do walks. They might have a ball, a gala. It could just be selling stuff that you've got someone to sign. You know, from there, it could be an auction that way. So it's lots of opportunities, I think, to create income. And one or other of those hopefully fits for your club. But if not, then I think that's where you need to look and think, well, okay, what do we need to change slightly as a club to make some of these more accessible for ourselves?
Angus, I wanted to link this bit back to something you said right near the start of the webinar. So at the moment, events might be quite difficult to hold because of the pandemic restrictions on social distancing and whatnot. But you said at the start that there's actually more funding available in a lot of areas because of the COVID pandemic. What kind of things would that allow a club to do that are possible in the current area where you might not be able to get people put together face to face?
Yeah, well, some of the funding is emergency driven in terms of, and I guess for some of the organisations that's not going to be valid. But some of the football club community programs going out and delivering emergency supplies, that kind of stuff. The way that it can be accessible to anyone, well, not to anyone, I think, is if you can deliver your programs online. So that's something to think about in terms of future capacity building. But if you've got programs that you can run online, then you know that's a way where you can be delivering against that, regardless, you know, because who knows, we might go into lockdowns again in the future. This might become a bit more of the norm. But yeah, there is lots of money around in relation to COVID-19. Either some money's been there to sort of help prop charities up, I think, because particular charities have been at risk of closing. If you can play a part in some of the issues that are coming out on the back of COVID-19, we've talked about these already. So loneliness and social isolation were big issues anyway. They're even bigger issues on the back of COVID-19. Mental health, and that's children, young people, adults, big problem anyway, even bigger problem on the back of COVID-19. So I guess it's just deciding where you as a bowls club, where you fit within that and where you're comfortable and what you can do from there. But if you can, yeah, it is tricky when you can't see people face to face, but you know, hopefully we're not a million miles away from being able to be back in front of people So there is that in the future. The other thing with funders is, certainly I've seen it with this, they're quite flexible at the moment in of putting delivery dates back because they want you to be doing that face-to-face delivery. But as an organisation nationally, I think with Bowl Scotland, it would be worth looking at how things could be delivered online in some shape or form, because that puts you in a strong position to be able to keep connected with your current members anyway, which has a benefit around that social isolation and loneliness bit, regardless of, you know, whether we're in lockdown or not.
Angus, just looking at the grant funding listed there and some of the things you've sort of touched upon, I wondered if there was any sort of top tips that you would offer to a sports club that were looking at grant funding, and I suppose that really is around where they would go to identify opportunities. But then secondly, I wonder if sports clubs sometimes get a bit of a fear around things like buzzwords that they feel like they need to include in applications. Have you got any advice around those two particular issues?
Yeah. To be honest, it's fairly easy to find the funding. You know, Funding Scotland, there's lots of websites that kind of, that in the main you can access either for free or with small subscriptions from there, which, you know, for my job's finding funding. There's no problem finding funding. It's more trying to match the funding up with the right organisations in terms of being able to do that. What I would say about that, the question about buzzwords, I understand that, but I think funders, the feedback I get when you can actually speak to funders is they hate those buzzwords. they want it written as if we're talking. They want to hear real stories. So actually, if you're not, which is a challenge for me because, you know, this is my job, so I'm trying to get it across sometimes that that it is coming from a sort of, I guess, a less professional approach from that. But actually, that's a strength. If you know what the issues are and you can put that across in normal words, I wouldn't let that scare you at all, because I think more and more funders, it might not work with funders, but for most funders, I think the lottery, people like Children in Need, they really want to hear stories. I think there's a good movement in the last year where funders are more interested, I think, in terms of the organizations that they're going to be investing into. And they understand that not everyone is extremely polished and not everyone can have a bid writer or a grant writer available to them. That's just not reality. So they understand that actually, you know, the language you use isn't the most important thing. I think what the main thing is, they want to see that you can do what you're saying. So you need to paint that picture, and it doesn't need to be eloquent. It doesn't need to be this, that, or the other, but they do need to get a feel for you as an organization and your commitment and your passion. And I think the people within the organizations are the best people to get that across. Equally, quite often there's funders now who the application will be a video, and that's not a scary thing. That will be you and your phone just talking. You know, if they quite often want that approach where you just do a 2-minute video explaining the issue. There you go. And some of the applications are still horrible. There are some out there that can take you forever to even make sense of. So again, part of the answer to that is doing a bit of research around the level you're at and the likelihood of funding that you're going to get, because there are some that are really, really competitive, whether there's others that, you know, you've got a better chance. I think the other thing is to try and get feedback. So if you're not successful, which the reality is you're not going to be sometimes, try and get that feedback from them as to why. Now, some of them aren't great at giving you that, but there are some good ones who will give you the feedback and will have that conversation with you and say, well, you know, 9 times out of 10, they'll just say they were oversubscribed. But sometimes you can get a few nuggets from them that can really be useful for you to go back in next time. And I think the key one is that local need and local consultation. You need to be able to get that across in your bids and saying, that's the reason why we're doing it, because there is a problem, whatever that problem is. And this is why we're doing it, because such and such came to us and said, look, can you put on an extra session on a Friday night because no one's got anything to do, not getting out of the house. You know, you just need that sort of those stories. So you save those up, you know, collect them as you're going about with your work, and just think, actually, that will be useful for a bid somewhere down the line. So yeah, I wouldn't be scared of that. I think the funding is relatively easy to find. Just go on Google, it's probably the easiest way from there, you know, but there are lots of funding out there. And once you get into it, you could spend all day looking at different funds. I suppose the bit that people need to get is be a bit more, I don't mean sensible, but be a bit more tuned into the ones that are better fit for them, either because of the structure they are or the areas that they're interested in funding. I mean, the interesting one again on things like we haven't quite touched on it, but that working with older people in general, you see things with like the football memories programs and things like that. But if you can work with older people who might have dementia, might have memory loss, things like there's programs you can develop, or there's programs that are already out there that can support people in that. Now, why not base some of that? I'm sure it's already happening with both, but why not do that more and more of that? Because there's again, that's a huge need in terms of from there, and that's a very fundable project. You know, at whatever level it takes, it doesn't need a lot of money really either. It's a bit of venue hire for if you've got club facilities themselves, maybe a bit of staff time or volunteer time, bit of refreshments from there, and that could be your starting point to doing a bit of what would be called sport for good, I guess. And then you use that as your case study going forward. So yeah, I think don't try and take on the world to begin with. You know, it needs to be sort of scalable in terms of where you're at. But yeah, I wouldn't let anyone put anyone off with that, because there's lots of funding out there. But you do need to do a bit of research just to make sure that you're giving yourself the best chance of success by going for a fund that A, is interested in funding the type of work you're proposing, that the geographic area fits, because sometimes there's funds that, you know, they're only interested in funding in particular postcodes or particular areas of deprivation, or you know, particular countries. You know, you might be wasting your time looking at a fund and actually you're not eligible to apply for it. So there's a bit of doing a bit of due diligence in the beginning to make sure you're on the right tracks with that, and probably going at it sensibly in terms of the scale that you're trying to apply for. So if you've never gone for anything before, probably starting quite small, you know, building up that, doing a really good job of then delivering that project, and then going back to that funder or another funder and saying, so it's, you know, you might eventually want to get a 50 grand project from someone. Maybe that starts with a 5 grand project that you deliver really well, and it goes next time you're doing a 10, 15,000 pounds project, and it might take you a few years to get to that point. I think that's realistic.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. I'm sure this will have been really helpful for clubs, Angus. And thank you for your time helping us put this webinar together. If people have questions that they want to ask of you, they can reach you through us, through Club Development Scotland, or just Google the name of the game, Angus Martin, and be able to find you directly. I think this has been a great introduction to the topic of fundraising, and there's lots of really interesting hooks in there that I think will be, you know, very easy, practical things for the clubs to follow up on and to start that journey. So thank you once again.
No, thank you. Enjoyed that. Thank you.